Welcome to episode 5 of Rise of a Nation. This episode is on Guatemala.
All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into Guatemalan history. I've got a ton of incredible sources here, historical accounts, documents, personal stories. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really quite a collection.
It is, and our goal today is to really unpack all of this, to understand how everything that's happened, all these events have shaped Guatemala into what we see today. I mean, we're talking about everything from Spanish conquest to the Central American Republic. There's a lot to cover.
Definitely. And what's so fascinating to me is how these different periods, they all kind of ripple into the next, You see these recurring themes popping up throughout Guatemalan history: power struggles, clashes of cultures, and this constant search for stability in the face of, well, let's just say, a lot of upheaval.
It's going to be a wild ride, that's for sure. So to kick things off, let's rewind all the way back, even before the Spanish conquistadors arrived.
Yeah.
What was the scene in pre-colonial Guatemala?
Well, the first thing to remember is that Guatemala, it wasn't this big unified empire like the Aztecs, You actually had a whole mix of independent Maya groups, the Quiche, the Kaqchikel, the Mam, and a bunch of others. And this is actually really important because this sort of fragmented political landscape, it played a huge role in how the Spanish conquest actually played out. It made things a lot more complex than a simple takeover.
That makes sense. But eventually the Spanish do arrive and enter Pedro de Alvarado, right? And from what I've read about this guy, he was, well, not exactly known for being a peaceful diplomat.
Yeah, no, not exactly. Alvarado, he came with a pretty brutal reputation already from his time in Mexico. He was known for ruthlessness, even among conquistadors, which is saying something. And that ruthlessness, sadly, it was on full display during the conquest of Guatemala. Some of the sources you sent, they detail some truly horrifying acts, especially in those early conquests.
Yeah, one of the sources actually talked about the psychological impact of horses on the Quiche. It wasn't just about the military advantage, was it?
No, not at all. Imagine, you're a Quiche warrior and you've never seen a horse before in your life. And suddenly you have these massive, powerful animals charging at you, ridden by men with weapons you've never seen before. I mean, that would have been absolutely terrifying, almost supernatural. And the Spanish, they were very aware of this, They used it to their advantage to instill fear and to disrupt traditional warfare tactics.
That's a really interesting point. Speaking of those early conquests, one of the forces mentioned the battle at Quetzaltenango as being especially significant. What happened there?
The Battle of Quetzaltenango, yeah, that was a pivotal moment in the conquest. It was the first major clash between the Spanish and the Quiche, and it ended in a decisive Spanish victory. The Quiche, they fought bravely, but they just weren't prepared for the Spanish weapons and tactics, They suffered heavy losses, including a lot of key leaders. It was a real turning point.
It almost sounds like that battle really broke the Quiche spirit.
It definitely dealt a devastating blow. After that, the Quiche, they were desperate to avoid further bloodshed. So they actually invited Alvarado into their capital, Cumarcaj, hoping to negotiate some kind of peace, offer tribute, anything to stop the fighting.
Wow, that seems incredibly risky, like inviting the enemy right into your capital.
It was a desperate move, a sign of just how badly the Spanish had shaken their confidence. But Alvarado, he was deeply suspicious. He saw treachery everywhere. And ultimately, his response was more violence, which eventually led to the fall of Cumarcaj. It's a tragic story, but it really highlights the brutal reality of the conquest.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, the Spanish were clearly a brutal force, but it wasn't just this straightforward march across Guatemala, was it? Some of the sources talk about alliances, rebellions. It seems like a much more complex situation.
Absolutely. The Spanish conquest, it wasn't a single event. It was this long, drawn-out process with shifting alliances and fierce resistance. Some Maya groups, like the Tzuchil, they initially sided with the Spanish, maybe hoping to gain some kind of advantage over their rivals. But even they eventually rebelled, when they realized what the Spanish were really after. It's classic divide and conquer that the Spanish used in their colonial campaigns.
So they were basically playing on existing rivalries to maintain control. But their influence, it went way beyond just military dominance, right? They reshaped Guatemalan society.
Oh, absolutely. They brought their language, their culture, Catholicism, all of that led to a mixing of traditions that you can still see in Guatemala today. New technologies and crops were introduced: sugarcane, coffee, which created a whole new economic order. But this new order, it often involved exploitative labor practices, and it reinforced this racial class system that basically privileged anyone of European descent.
It's a pattern that just, unfortunately, repeats itself throughout history, doesn't it? Colonial powers, they often bring about these drastic changes, but rarely for the benefit of the native populations.
Yeah, sadly, you're right. And these changes, they had lasting consequences for Guatemala. The concentration of Maya populations in the highlands, the racial hierarchies, the economic inequalities, these are all things that you can trace back to Spanish colonialism. And these effects are still visible in Guatemala today.
It's incredible how these historical events continue to shape the present. So, after centuries of Spanish rule, Guatemala finally reaches the era of independence. I'm guessing this wasn't a clean break either, right?
Oh, not at all. Guatemala declared independence from Spain in 1821, but that was really just the beginning of another turbulent chapter. There was so much uncertainty. You had all these different factions vying for power, trying to figure out what the future of this newly independent nation would look like.
And it's during this time that we see the emergence of the Federal Republic of Central America. I have to admit, I was surprised to learn how much the U.S. Constitution inspired this republic.
Yeah, it's a fascinating parallel. The Republic, it was founded on a lot of the same ideals: democracy, federalism, individual rights, all concepts borrowed straight from the U.S. system. But the challenge, and they learned this pretty quickly, was putting those ideals into practice. Having the blueprints is one thing, but you need the right foundations to actually build on.
And from what I've read, it seems like this republic was struggling with instability right from the start. Deep divisions, political maneuvering, conflict. It almost sounds a lot like the early years of the U.S., with all its growing pains.
That's a great comparison. These weren't just little squabbles, These were serious disagreements about the future of the republic. You had some who wanted to keep ties to the monarchy, maybe even annex to Mexico, while others were fiercely Republican, pushing for a truly independent Central America.
And this clash of visions, it eventually leads to the first Civil War, right? Liberals versus conservatives battling for control of the republic's destiny.
Exactly. The 1825 election of Manuel José Arce as the republic's first president, that was a real turning point. He campaigned on a liberal platform, but then once he was in power, he started making all these concessions to the conservatives. And that really alienated a lot of his supporters and set the stage for a bitter power struggle. Classic case of political pragmatism backfiring.
So who ended up winning this first Civil War?
The Liberals, led by Francisco Morazan, they managed to come out on top. But Morazan's presidency, which lasted from 1830 to 1838, it didn't exactly bring peace and stability. The Republic was still plagued by invasions, rebellions, constant constitutional reforms. Sometimes winning the war doesn't mean you win the peace.
It's true. Just getting rid of your opponents doesn't magically erase those underlying tensions or solve those fundamental disagreements, right?
Exactly. And all those unresolved tensions, they finally boiled over again in 1838. A second civil war erupted, and this time it led to the collapse of the Federal Republic. It was a tragic end to a really bold experiment. It's a reminder that unity, even when it's built on shared ideals, it's fragile. It takes more than good intentions to make it last.
So the Central American Republic dissolved, and Guatemala was back to being an independent nation. But now they had some new challenges, like defining their borders. It seems like these border treaties were a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. After all that chaos, establishing those clear boundaries with Mexico, El Salvador, and Honduras, it was crucial for Guatemala to move forward. The treaties, they weren't perfect, but they did help to prevent immediate conflict and create some stability in the region. It was a critical step towards solidifying their sovereignty. Welcome back to our deep dive into Guatemalan history. Last time, we left off with Guatemala figuring out its borders after that whole Central American Republic fell apart. But there's this one border issue that's still going on today, the Belize situation.
Yeah, Belize. It's one of those things that just seems rooted in a lot of messy history, doesn't it? Like going all the way back to colonial times.
Exactly. Guatemala claims that Britain basically didn't hold up its end of a treaty they made in 1859 about Belize, which back then was British Honduras. So they argue that Belize's independence, which they declared in 1981, isn't actually legitimate.
So it's like a disagreement over land, who owns what, and who gets to say what goes on there, all stemming from a treaty made, over 100 years ago?
Exactly. It just shows you how these actions from way back when, they have a way of coming back and shaping things even centuries later. The Belize dispute is still causing tension, and people are still trying to figure out how to resolve it.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something in the past. It really does affect us today. But for now, I think we should shift gears a bit and talk about a period that had a huge impact on Guatemala, the Civil War.
Okay, yeah. But before we get into the actual fighting and everything, I think it's really important to understand what led up to it. Because in the early 20th century, Guatemala was facing some serious problems, especially inequality. You had dictators like Jorge Ubico who enforced these brutal labor practices, and there was a huge gap between the wealthy and everyone else.
Right. And didn't the United Fruit Company have a lot to do with that, too? One of the sources I sent over really highlighted their influence in all of this.
Yeah, United Fruit was this huge American corporation, and they basically had a ton of power in Guatemala. They owned a lot of land, and they had a lot of influence in the government. A lot of people saw them as a symbol of foreign exploitation, profiting from the country's resources, but not really helping the people who lived there. And that made them a target for those who wanted change. And then there was their role in the overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. That was a major turning point.
Okay, the Arbenz overthrow. This is where things get really interesting, almost like a spy movie. The U.S. decided to intervene because they were convinced Arbenz was a communist, even though there wasn't much evidence to support that.
Yeah, it was the Cold War, remember? The U.S. was really focused on stopping the spread of communism, even if it meant getting involved in other countries' affairs and even supporting coups. And with Arbenz, his land reforms, which kind of threatened the United Fruit Company's interests, that was enough for the U.S. to label him as a communist.
It's kind of wild to think that a country would interfere in another country's business like that, based on, well, not a lot of proof.
Yeah, but the fear of communism was very real back then, and it definitely led to some actions that, well, don't look so good now. And the CIA's role in that coup, it's pretty remarkable.
Tell me about it. Using dummy parachutes and fake radio broadcasts to mess with the Guatemalan army. Like, did that really work?
It did. It's crazy, right? The CIA basically ran this elaborate psychological operation, spreading misinformation and propaganda to make the Guatemalan army think there was a much bigger rebel force than there actually was. It was all about destabilizing the government and setting the stage for a U.S.-backed regime change.
So this U.S.-backed coup, was that really the spark that ignited the Civil War a few years later?
Pretty much. When Arbenz was removed and a pro-U.S. government was put in place, it created a lot of anger and resentment, especially among the people who had benefited from his reforms. All those existing tensions, they just boiled over, and eventually that led to the outbreak of armed conflict in 1960.
Okay, so once the war starts, who are the main players here? Who is fighting who?
So on one side, you have the Guatemalan military. They're backed by the wealthy elite and, of course, the U.S. government. They saw the war as this fight against communist insurgents, a threat to their power and their way of life.
And on the other side?
On the other side were a bunch of leftist guerrilla groups. They were fighting for social justice, economic equality, an end to all the oppression that had been going on in Guatemala for centuries. They were united under an organization called the URNG, the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unity.
So it's essentially the establishment versus the revolutionaries.
Yeah.
But in terms of, actual fighting power, it seems like a total mismatch. How could these guerrilla groups possibly compete with a whole military?
They couldn't really win a traditional war, so they focused on guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, sabotage. It was all about disrupting the military, undermining the government's control, especially in rural areas, and trying to win over the people. And actually, in the early years of the war, they had a lot of support from the indigenous population in the countryside. A lot of them saw the guerrillas as liberators.
But how did the government respond to that kind of warfare?
Their response was brutal, and often it didn't matter who they hit. They used a scorched earth policy, basically trying to destroy anything that could help the guerrillas. They destroyed villages, massacred civilians who they thought were sympathetic to the rebels. It was all about using terror to crush any opposition.
It's terrifying to think about. One of the sources I sent over talked about a really disturbing incident in Chujul in 1979. Can you tell me about that?
The Chujul incident. Yeah, it's a really chilling example of how far the military was willing to go. They kidnapped a bunch of peasants, dressed them up as guerrillas, and then staged a fake attack on their own troops. Then they killed the peasants and claimed they were insurgents, using that whole thing as an excuse to crack down even harder on the local population.
That is so messed up.
Yeah.
The fact that a government would do something like that, manipulate the truth, just to justify violence against its own people, is hard to believe.
It shows you just how paranoid and ruthless the regime was. They saw any kind of challenge as a threat that had to be eliminated no matter the cost. And tragically, the indigenous population really suffered because of that.
Yeah, the impact on the Mayan people was devastating.
Yeah. Mayan communities were constantly accused of supporting the guerrillas, and they were often targeted for collective punishment. The killings, the disappearances, the destruction of their villages, all of that has been recognized as genocide.
Genocide is a serious accusation. Is there evidence to back that up?
A UN Truth Commission investigated all of this, and they concluded that what the army did to the Mayan people, especially in the early 1980s, was genocide. They were trying to destroy their culture, their way of life, the scale of the violence, the targeting of civilians, the intent to wipe out a specific ethnic group. It all points to genocide.
It's just awful, a reminder of how cruel humans can be, especially during conflict.
Yeah.
And what's even worse, the U.S., even though they knew about all of this, they kept supporting the Guatemalan military.
That's right. They kept sending them weapons, training, intelligence, basically allowing those human rights abuses to continue. It's a dark chapter in U.S. foreign policy, that's for sure.
It's hard to believe a country that's supposed to stand for democracy and freedom would be involved in something like that.
Yeah.
But even with all of that, the guerrillas, they kept fighting.
It's amazing, isn't it? They were up against so much, but they were determined. And by the early 1980s, they were actually getting stronger and carrying out these bolder attacks. They even hit targets in Guatemala City.
Wait, they attacked the capital.
They did. In 1980, one of the main guerrilla groups, the EGP, bombed a spot near the National Palace. It was a symbolic attack, showing that they could reach the heart of the government. And it definitely sent a message that the conflict was far from over.
So it sounds like they were making progress, at least in terms of putting pressure on the government. So what eventually led to the end of the war? Did one side win?
The next part will come out soon. Thank you for watching episode 5 of Rise of a Nation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's independence and expansion you would like me to cover next.